Welcome to Design Thinking Games, a fantasy and user experience podcast. Each episode, your podcast hosts, Tim Broadwater and Michael Schofield, will examine the player experience of board games, pen and paper role-playing games, live-action games, mobile games, and video games. You can find every episode, including this one, on your podcatcher of choice and on the web at designthinkinggames.com.
This episode is brought to you by listeners like you at patreon.com/designthinkinggames. So, if we are talking about the thing that I think we're talking about, are we talking about the thing I think we're talking about?
This is how sequels always start, right? They you think you know what you're going to get, and every so often you are stopped like right up front. You get a cold surprise, welcome or not. Let's transition weirdly into Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt because
it's definitely a sequel.
Is it? Let's talk about this. Okay, so 17 years ago, and when games were, I guess games are good now. When games were still good, but good in a different way. Vampire the Masquerade: Bloodline. Was that right? Gosh, now I'm second guessing myself. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines came out, and it was. We talked about this a little bit in our VTM episode, so I'm not going to go deep, but it was a transformative game. It was a great RPG, standalone, with multiple threads in the style that folks may think of like BioWare games. It had goodish voice acting, a little stilted because the main character you play is like from Renaissance Europe, and it sounds a little silly, but in general, the voice acting was on point. The powers were cool. The mood was right. Cool RPG.
And it has a sequel, right? This year, 2021, Vampire Bloodlines, The Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Indeterminate release date. All they keep saying is Q3, Q4, right?
It's one of those games that have been delayed a little bit, but yeah. So what we're ending up is roughly in the same time period, and if we zoom out into like a 20-year time span, give or take a month or a quarter, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 and Vampire the Masquerade Blood Hunt are going to come out roughly around the same period.
It's interesting. 2 vampire games this year. Yeah.
Well, it's caused a little bit of confusion. The White Wolf, who are the owners of Vampire the Masquerade, are trying to put Vampire as an IP out in front of more people beyond just like the tabletop. I think they're trying to chase that D&D glory that, Wizards of the Coast are really enjoying right now. But yeah, because of that, we have 2 game IPs releasing roughly around the same time. A lot of concern about the sequel proper, Bloodlines 2, and a lot of confusion about the question mark sequel, Blood Hunt. Whether or not it's even a sequel or anything, but just basically tagging on to that IP has created a lot of consternation because what Blood Hunt is not an RPG.
See, I always get confused about this with Call of Duty. I'm not a duty person. I know that some people are duty people, and that's fine. But
I'm pretty sure the Call of Duty people don't call themselves duty people.
I call them duty people? No, that's a lot of shade. I'm sorry. But it's like I get lost. I have no idea. And it's like Assassin's Creed as well. And like at one point you get to where, is there a timeline? I don't understand the time. Or is there just sequels? Or are we just now putting a word of flavor? And it's like Resident Evil for the longest time adhered to like a number system, and then it started going Veronica and like other stuff, and then it's like, well, wait, where does this kind of fit in? Legend of Zelda, another example to where there are no numbers except 2, The Adventures of Link. The rest of them have no numbers, and so there are many internet pages dedicated to like how the timeline works and which one's first. And now we know that Skyward Sword is the very first one in the actual timeline. And then the timeline splits, into 3 different timelines, is if the hero fails versus if the hero doesn't, or if the hero wins, and then there's different, it's just crazy, right?
Do they continue like the story after the hero, like in the hero fail state? Do they actually continue that narrative?
It does. And so the timeline that's put together by fans factors in if Ganon is stopped or not stopped in the Legend of Zelda ones. And so I believe, if my understanding of it is correct, that there is what is known as the dark timeline, or the hero is defeated, the hero is successful, and then the hero is successful splits into 2 timelines because there's time travel in Legend of Zelda. So there's the child era versus the adult era.
Wow.
The child era, if the hero succeeds, is like Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess and Four Swords, whereas like, if it is the adult era where he succeeds, it's the Wind Waker or Spirit Tracks or Phantom Hourglass. But if the hero's defeated, A Link to the Past, Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening, and then eventually the first Legend of Zelda and Adventure of Link. It's just crazy. It's baffling.
Was that intentional, or are these like fan theories?
I think that's a good thing to talk about, because I think, for the player or user, right? And the reason why we're kind of talking about, this in general is sequels. Why the numbering, or just spiritual sequels, or the theming, right? But then also, we also live in a time to where, apart from the craziness or shenanigans that can happen when you introduce numbers and break away from numbers, or if you misnumber things, or you don't use numbers, you're just using words, and then, well, where does it fit, in the timeline? You also have prequelization, where like prequels come out after the original one, with like Outlast 2, then there's Outlast Whistleblower, which is the third one, but it actually takes place before one. And then apart from that, in spiritual sequels, we have alternate timelines kind of stuff, right? And then you also have things that are like Mass Effect, game carryover, like what you do in your first game gets saved and persists to the second game and affects things. But now, technology-wise, we all know that software is... When you buy the CD, it literally just goes into your gaming console to download the file, right? Because you don't have software proper anymore. That's on Nintendo is literally the only one still doing the cartridge, right? But even if you put in the cartridge, you're still downloading gigs of files on a Switch, right? But then with DLC, it's like, do we even need to make a 2 or a 3 or a 4? Why make a whole new game if all we're just going to do is give you more quests, more stories, more items, So then you just have an ever-expanding game as opposed to the traditional sequel that we're all used to. So
that's the Rockstar formula, right? So like how Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, 10 years ago? Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. And they've constantly expanded the universe, introduced tons of different games, new physics, they're able to patch. One of the functional reasons of sequels in games, let's forget like sequelization of like novels and cinema for a minute, but like just in games, is one of the things with sequels is that it provides literally a demarcation where teams can build brand new technology tailored to new platforms that didn't exist prior. They can load in a whole bunch of stuff and kind of see how it plays. So the demarcation between Title 1 and Title 2 and Title 3 not only represents like narrative sequelization, but new technology. Mm-hmm. Rockstar doesn't have to do this anymore. In fact, nobody really has to do this. And that kind of introduces kind of an interesting point, which is, why? why would they release like a Grand Theft Auto 6 ever?
Yeah.
Right? Why?
Everyone's having the same freak out when on the Nintendo front with Breath of the Wild, because Breath of the Wild 2, I mean, is it its own game, or is it just DLC? They don't change any of the rendering engine. They don't change any of the graphics. You know, it is literally new content. And so, but Breath of the Wild 2 is kind of how it's being presented, but it's just going to be DLC for 1.
Do they know whether there is like a new voice actor cast or new deep narrative coming for 2?
So there's already, Nintendo is like one of the last people who actually participate in E3, because everyone's just, I think, abandoned E3, but in their 2021 E3, you know, kind of demo, they actually had a 2-minute long preview of the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and they leave it untitled, but everyone refers to it as Breath of the Wild 2.
Interesting. And
it is the same on Google search, it's Breath of the Wild 2. And so it's kind of this thing to where, you know, when you're trying to break the mold and change the model to, it's like, hey, we have this world that works, we have a system that works, you know, everything we have is golden, so why can't we just keep adding more to it, like adding more map, adding more stories, adding more quests, and let that, you know, kind of shape it out. And so I feel like you have the traditional people who are thinking, no, it has to be a new game that has a new title, and people are opposed to, you know, the DLC sequel, you know. And so I think what's interesting here is, what is user preference or player preference versus what people think it is, right?
Yeah, the way, you know, the way my gears started to spin were toward identifying what the jobs to be done here are. And on the developer side, I think the job to be done of sequelization is pretty clear. A sequel is a convenient production container, right? It's something that can have a finite budget. You can see a finite or constrained return on investment. You hire or contract VO and engineering work and whatever design work for that specific unit product. And I get it that as a business, equalization makes sense because, you know, you need to modularize things for your own sanity. I can appreciate that long-running, super long-running franchises that are, let's call it, largely DLC. Maybe something like World of Warcraft. I can appreciate like that. The management of such a thing is probably more difficult. Potentially.
Like DVDs like that as well. Or Guild Wars, you know, when you add new content.
Well, you know, and the job to be done for like users, for, you know, like when a sequel comes out, I would guess probably relates to the job for the developers. There's something about a sequel versus DLC that you pointed out where I think a sequel represents, whether or not anyone would use this language, but, you know, let's feel this out. I think I'm onto something here, but a sequel represents a focused allocation of money from the developer. And so when you see a sequel, you expect, you know, production value, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas DLC literally sounds cheaper. I mean, that's the suggestion, you know?
It does. And what you were saying before, which is, you know, a sequel traditionally was like, hey, we have new tech, we have a new console, so let's release something on this new hardware capability. And so the software is matched to the hardware, right? But I think what we're seeing increasingly is software being agnostic of hardware.
Sure.
We are in a time to where recently this year, Netflix has announced they're going into gaming. And those games can be delivered on whatever you get the Netflix app. So that could be your PlayStation, your phone, your Roku TV, or whatever. So it doesn't really matter what the hardware is, right? And then, but to me, as opposed to thinking of it like hardware, and I know we've talked previously about the great interaction models hardware that Nintendo uses, because Nintendo, in that regards, is always ahead of the curve. You know, they had the first 3D rendering on the 64. You know, that was that's why the controllers look like Star Fox chips, in my opinion. But then the GameCube
what an observation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the GameCube is the first one that lets you plug in 4 controllers by default. And the games were like, let's do Super Smash Brothers or Teen Titans or Godzilla Destroy All Monsters, which allows 4 players on the screen at the same time. Then they went into motion control with the Wii, and then they had the first tablet, and the tablet was literally a step to the Switch. And then the first cursor, or not cursor, but pen interaction with the DS and 3DS. And so I like the hardware chasing, you know what I mean? But there are certain gamers who don't care about the hardware at all. And I'm not saying just certain, maybe it's a lot of gamers. But what they love about Mario is the fun side-scrolling mechanics of it, and how, from one edition to another, are those mechanics improved. In Monster Hunter, which has tons of sequels, how do they look at the previous? I think there's a piece here that is also, how do we improve? How do we improve? How do we improve? So,
right.
Apart from the hardware piece, there is, how do we keep the essence of it, add to the world, the narrative, but then also improve gameplay. So it seems like it's a tough like order to fill, right? And so like what people love about the new Monster Hunter Rise, which just came out for the Switch, is everything that was laborious and took tons of time and was a huge time suck, they automated. And just by doing that, like gathering materials, mining, fishing, like doing all these things that were just like, dude, this just takes so much time. They just made it, oh no, it's one click. You just have to go do it. And people loved it, because then the focus became on hunting the monsters and killing the monsters, not like all of the tedious things that, you know, that everyone is used to it, or is used to being a monster. So that type of improvement, like improving the gameplay, but adding to the story and embracing the hardware advances, I mean, to me, is kind of what sequels were about. But some of them never change, right? I mean, some games, like every single one that comes out, it is literally the same. And I think that's maybe where the perception of it is why certain people maybe don't get into certain franchises.
Well, and I think, you know, we're kind of in a time, both, you know, technologically and I don't know, spiritually maybe, where sequelization is a big umbrella category for a lot of different things. You're talking about Monster Hunter Rise. And I was going to ask that you consider that a proper sequel, or is it an expansion? Do you consider an expansion a sequel?
Yeah, so that is also
it's just where it starts to get weird, you know?
Yeah, that's where it also, like, they just kind of jump and change, like, in the middle of the processes, right? So Monster Hunter is started out, first off, it's been on a lot of different platforms, right? And I think Monster Hunter, you have Monster Hunter, then Monster Hunter 2, right? And then for Wii, they did Tri, but 3. And then there was 4 that came out on 3DS, and then they abandoned it, the numbering system. Then it became World, and then it became Rise, and as it went to PlayStation or Xbox or Switch. And so I feel like the numbering is something maybe from the 80s that we all have to deal with. Because
that could be, because that
because Street Fighter seems to be that way. Like the only thing that I know that sticks, I would also say Resident Evil, right?
Yeah.
It's a video game series, And then essentially what we're looking at is the video game series. I can't even tell you like all the things, but there's a Resident Evil 2, 3 is Nemesis. Then there's Veronica, then Zero, which comes out, I guess, before the first one. Then there's remakes of them, Outbreak, Resident Evil 5, 6, 7. So they're keeping largely to the same number series, just like Final Fantasy does. Final Fantasy is very specific to the numbers. And when they say Final Fantasy 16, people know what that is, because they've played 6, 7, 8, 9, or 1, 2, 3, and 4.
As a user, as a player, as a consumer, I find sequelization obnoxious. I am often confused, because like when I think of a sequel, I am thinking of the narrative next step. The fact that like say Mortal Kombat 1 and Mortal Kombat 2 like largely lead from one to the other, I think is an accident or a loose, because I do not consider Mortal Kombat 2 a sequel when we're talking about it. I would consider Mass Effect 2 a sequel to Mass Effect 1. Red Dead Redemption 2 is actually a prequel to Red Dead Redemption 1. But there's but something like when you're getting into like Assassin's Creed, right? I think they kind of stopped numbering things after 3. They are loosely aligned, but so loosely, rooted in kind of like the same narrative that, eventually they do what I think sequels do, and that like trends towards the entropy of just dropping the numbers entirely, and considering themselves expansions. But as a user, it's hard because like, hey, there's like I'm an Xbot, but one day I'm going to pick up like a PS4 or a PS5, and I'm going to go play some of those like Naughty Dog games. And I tend to expect that I can't play Last of Us 2 before I play Last of Us 1. That's probably true.
I'm the same way. I will make myself do a horrible prequel that's 10 years old.
Well, you're doing that now, right? You're playing, or you have played Mass Effect 1.
I started out with, this is one of my favorite games, as you know, Evil Within. I saw the trailer for Evil Within 2 at like E3 years ago, and it gave me shivers. Like, it was like, dude, this is something I need to play. But then when I found out, like, oh, the first one came out for PS2, it's really old, Oof. And so or PS3 maybe, I can't remember. I went and played it. It was painful. So I get why people say that. They're like, just start with 2, don't worry about. But I will say, there is so much context and story.
I was going to ask if there was...
You will miss, and you will not feel, and it will not hit you in the feels. 2 will not hit you in the feels if you did not play 1,
That seems like a proper sequel, right? And that's really interesting, because that's kind of like what you expect. Where it becomes spooky is like the Final Fantasy game, or things that have like tons of sequels. Bro, I haven't played Final Fantasy since 7. So like
well, the numbering there is like crazy, like because basically like Final Fantasy 1 comes out many years ago and it's released in Japan and US, and it's like Final Fantasy. But then 2 and 3 come out in Japan, but they don't get released in the US. And then Final Fantasy 4 comes out in Japan, they release it in the US, and they change the number to 2. And it's just like, that's a whole nother issue.
Well, so my general argument here, and maybe I'm not making the argument, my general feeling is that sequelization is bad for player usability.
And I think it's where it's properly used to, and I think this is, kind of what you were getting to, is when it fuels the story, right? So like, definitely they're playing Last of Us 2 without playing Last of Us is you're missing out so much. If there is something that is like, I don't know if you know the Legend of Zelda, the Oracle of Seasons and the Oracle of Ages. It's like a light dark version. Yin Yang, the two games exist simultaneously, and actions you do in one game affect the other game.
Oh, that's cool.
But you need the left part of the story for the right part of the story. So I like that model because it tells a story. Similar to that is Shovel Knight, and I'm not sure if you've ever...
I've played Shovel Knight, yeah.
You have?
Yeah, I've never beaten it, but yeah, I've played it.
Yeah, so Shovel Knight is amazing. If you like those grindy, hard, old school side-scrolling games, it is there. And like if you're a Mega Man person, or you are
it's very Mega Man-y.
Metroid, or you like if you are into Metroidvania games, which is what they call, is an actual genre that is like the map and side-scrolling. Yacht Club Games came out with Shovel Knight, and it's like, hey, this is the tech, this is what it looks like. It looks old school, pixelated. However, we're not changing our engine here. We're going to release 4 games. They're all going to tell you 4 different sides of stories of the same story. So you play the first one, Shovel Knight, which is Shovel of Hope, and it tells you Shovel Knight's story, where he's like the main hero and he's saving another knight that he works with, But then you get to play Shovel Knight Plague of Shadows, where it's like you're an evil guy who's one of the evil knights you go up against, who is for the evil queen. But you see, his story is different. The reason why he's doing what he's doing is totally different motivations, right? But then when you play the third one, Spectre of Torment, or the fourth one, which is King of Cards, they're all like different stories of the same game, but different perspectives and motivations, much like Octopath Traveler.
That's really interesting.
I love sequelization for story. And I'm not a story person, you know that. We've talked about that, but I love sequelization for story. I don't like sequelization when it's Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Alpha, Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
I think when we're talking about like Street Fighter, right? We're talking about product containerization, right? We're talking about different technologies like Streetwater.
Milking a franchise.
Well, that's probably it too, right? I mean, one of the ideas about sequels, which may, like the popularity may come from like the 80s, is that your sequel, your Destiny 2, will make a lot more money than revamped Destiny expansion. You know that when Grand Theft Auto eventually comes out, Rockstar is going to make $1 billion, right? So, and it's one of those things where it could technically be built on the same thing, but there's a product moment around these kinds of sequels that are lucrative to the company. To your point earlier in the episode, I wonder if we are in the death throes of that type of sequel now that technology doesn't require it. And like, because now the barrier to entry to create games in a particular IP is lower than it has ever been. And the technology doesn't require product containerization because you can ship entirely new engines over the wire. I mean, it's interesting. So like I have some vocabulary, and what we're kind of discussing when we're talking about Blood Hunt, and some of the others, like Octopath Traveler, we're talking about something that is classified, I think technically, by the Library of Congress as a standalone sequel, a work set in the same universe that has very little, if any, narrative connection to its predecessor and can stand on its own. One of the, and we kind of talked about like the sort of product containerization thing. Another thing that's, and of course, like Library of Congress isn't going to classify a sequel like that, although I think the point stands. Another one that's coming straight out of our background in kind of an engineering and tech world is sequel as semantic versioning. Some of our listeners may not know, and why would they, that the numbers on versions like 1.0, 1.2, 2.0, 2.1, 2.2 have meaning. And a lot of the times it's a 3 number based system where it's like 1.1.1. where the rightmost number is a patch or a bug fix. The middlemost number, the middlemost number is an additive feature that doesn't break anything, and the first number, the 1 to 2, the 2 to 3, represents a breaking change. And so when it comes to software,
Oh, wait a second. What do you mean by breaking change?
Oh, a breaking change, yeah. So in software, like semantic versioning describes, it tries to standardize how these version numbers are made. And the idea of going from 1.0 to 2.0 is that you are signaling to consumers of your software that whatever you've done or used or built around 1.0 should not be expected to work. You are signaling that there is a breaking difference between 1.0 and 2.0. And so I don't know that players know this internally, but when it occurred to me, I guess when we were talking, is like one of the great reasons for maybe doing a version change like that, a 2.0 to 3.0, isn't just for the ability to market the shit out of it and squeeze all the dollars out of it. But it's a signal, not so much that something's new, although people interpret it as that. They expect new software, new goods, new changes or whatever, bug fixes or whatever, but also that it is not going to work in the same way. It's saying like this is significantly different. So
substantial enough change,
reset your expectations.
Code, like we've changed from the core, build it from the ground up differently, or have made it more efficient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like if an API is 1.0 to 2.0, your whatever you built around that 1.0 API will probably break if you upgrade. So that's like when I'm looking at these like Library of Congress classifications of sequels, like we just added 2, right? From engineering numbers. And I think one of the things with games is that you're smashing the right brain of the game industry, which is like narrative and story and experience, with a left brain, which is engineering. and it kind of like mushes together. And I wonder if that might be a reason why numbering systems are stupid bananas and hard and like at this point baffling.
So with semantic versioning, and we think about things of software, that's one piece of it that's going to play into how it works, but then also the story piece as well. So the story piece may or may not relate to the semantic versioning, is kind of what we're saying. And so does it matter having Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 16? Or can we just have DLC, which would be, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, version of the software. And then, of course, there's a purchasing model. Like, we want to sell DLC, right? We want to make money from it, And will we get $5 from a player if we add DLC? Or is it better to get $60, from a brand new game or version? Will they pay more if it's an expansion of the story?
That's fascinating. Yeah, and I can see the motivation coming either direction. Sometimes it sounds counterintuitive. Sometimes it's cheaper to rebuild the whole thing from the ground up, once you build enough what they call like technical debt or whatever. And so I can totally see a world where it's like, hey, Unity 5 is out, and we need to rebuild on this new engine, and we're just gonna scrap everything because now the developers who work in this framework don't exist anymore because it's 20 years old, and we're going to get something new. We're gonna start from scratch, breaking change, new number. Then creative has to be like, oh shit. Well, do they just slap a new story onto that? And I think what we might be pinpointing is, if anything, is like why numbering systems for games are strange, because it is a question like, hey, is this a book? Is this a narrative? Is this like a movie? Is this art, or is this technology? And the answer is yes. Yeah.
There is an answer already. I mean, or let me give you an example of what you just described. We have The Last of Us. We have The Last of Us 2. Huge award-winning games on both accounts. Phenomenal story. Makes the player hurt at what difficult decisions they need to make, right? Last of Us Left Behind, which is the DLC that is for the first one, The Last of Us, which expanded the story and showed Ellie's girlfriend and that kind of relationship, which they built out between 1 and 2. That is like, seems to be like the win-win, right? It's like, this is DLC that also furthers the story, and people want that story piece. But it is DLC, you had to pay for it, So I think that is probably,
Is it considered one of the problems I think, like, as a player with DLC is that, I don't know, like if I had to look at DLC, like I think my bias is that it's at least skippable, right? So like with something like that, which I seem to remember, like, the news around, that revelation was huge. But is that considered, like, do you need to have played? Is that considered like an extension of 1, as in like 1 isn't complete without this additive story before you can get to 2, or could you skip it?
So my understanding of this from playing the games and not have playing the DLC, but kind of knowing 1 and 2 and kind of what the DLC is that that's character is in 1 proper, but it's kind of this, you never know what happens. There seemed to be like something there, some meaning in their relationship, either they're really good friends or whatever, If you wanted that story being developed, that's it. That's what you get it for. I think it's kind of, that is related to the story, and it kind of adds and fleshes out. It's character development for Ellie. You know what I mean? That's what you're paying for. It's very different than BioShock, where they will literally just DLC the crap out of you for a whole new story, or just a little mini game, or like a new kind of thing in the same place. And like, this also happened in Rapture. Pay for it. You know what I mean? It's like, that doesn't really contribute to the main story, but it does show another story that happened on the same maps. And to me, that feels like I'm not going to say disingenuous, but it's like I'm less inclined to experience this also happened versus like, oh, this is a deeper dive into character development or the story or what was going on. Just for me.
So the Library of Congress classifies what you just described as a midquill.
A midquill?
a midquill. Yeah. Stories that take place between 2 preceding stories, or between events, but serve as a sequel to none, right? It's lore building, right? It's like, hey, tell me more about this red dragon from beyond the hills. I'm surely like, it's 200 years, it's Smaug or whatever. Clearly it's eating a whole bunch of villages and stuff. Tell us a story about those villages, right? It's like in the same world. It's lore that doesn't change the valley. It doesn't change what happens to Bilbo and his companions. But it's more, right? Like, that's what it is. It's more.
We put a lot of work into design thinking games, so if you like what we do and want to help us cover some costs, then consider supporting us at patreon.com/designthinkinggames. We also are Design Thinking Games on TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter.
Thank you for listening to the Design Thinking Games podcast. To connect with your hosts, Michael or Tim, please go to designthinkinggames.com, where you can request topics, ask questions, or see what else is going on. Until next time, game on.